the dawn of the 15th century, Japan was a war-torn country with hundreds of daimyo and samurai fighting to rise to power in a feudal, hierarchical, class-based society. The daimyo were the leaders of their own provinces that were guarded by samurai, who in return got land and supplies.
The samurai followed a strict and honor-based code of Bushido, or the way of the warrior. Bushido called upon the willingness of a warrior to sacrifice his life in service of his master.
The daimyo that conquered the most land and defeated the shogun would become the new shogun. Consequently, from 1467 to 1576, there was a civil war period called Sengoku. It was a time of full-scale warfare, lacking a central authority to be able to re-establish order. During this time, a Japanese warrior named Tokugawa Ieyasu gathered an army of samurai and began to conquer Japan. By 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu had officially formed a fully functioning government known as the Tokugawa shogunate. Strongly influenced by Neo-Confucianism, the Tokugawa shogunate stressed the importance of morals, education, and hierarchical order in government and society.
They had a strict social class, much like that of feudal Europe. At the bottom were the peasants, who made up about 3/4 of the population, along with merchants and the artisans. Above them were the samurai warriors and the daimyo. At the top of the social pyramid was the shogun, the war ruler. Finally came the emperor, who was actually only a symbolic ruler and did not actually do any real ruling.
This created a very rigid system of class and political power marked by strict rules of social and political conduct. Further restricting the Japanese society, the Tokugawa shogunate also outlawed Christianity and persecuted Christians until the 18th century, when it became necessary to improve relations with European countries.
The Tokugawa period was a time when agricultural production and domestic trade were flourishing, but scientific production and international trade were nearly non-existent.
The Tokugawa shogunate oppressed its citizens and did not allow Japan to grow. The rigid social classes and lack of scientific production compared to the rest of the world caused desire for a revolution. Eventually, the people of Japan got tired and overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, along with the traditional Japanese feudal government structure. This period of reform is known as the Meiji Restoration. Samurai from two southern provinces, Satsuma and Choshu, took up arms against the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. Several samurai statesmen of the shogunate were assassinated. In the rebellion, representatives from the imperial armies against the Tokugawa promised diminished tax levies to the peasant leaders, promises which created a flurry of hope and optimism for the rebels. Japan's cities and countrysides were mostly quiet, while warfare was samurai versus samurai. On April 6, 1868, the charter oath was issued in the new emperor's name, promising to minimize resistance among the daimyo as well as fairness and change.
There was now no distinction between the samurai and the commoners. There had been a two-sword symbol of the samurai that only samurai had the right to wear, but in 1876 the Imperial Council banned the symbols since all men were to have an equal right to advancement. The samurai did not like either of these things.
Samurai wanted to increase Japan's national pride by strengthening Japan's military and economy, but their outdated army was not enough against advanced Western armies. In an attempt to correct this, the Imperial Council resolved to create a Western-style army. They organized a modern army and navy, yet these changes were not universally supported. So in 1877, a prestigious samurai by the name of Saigo Takamori led a samurai revolt against the Imperial Council. He fought for 6 months with 30,000 casualties, but eventually, in a battle that they were losing, Saigo asked a friend to behead him out of honor, and his friend followed through. His defeat marked the end of the official samurai status in Japan, and the reforms pressed on unquestioned. Later, Prince Musuhito was crowned the 122nd Emperor of Japan. He changed his name to Meiji, which means enlightened rule. He was only 15 years old when he took the throne. There was an elected parliament called the Diet. The emperor and his court moved from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo and declared Japan's capital. The leaders and successors of the revolution carried out reforms in the emperor's name. Unfortunately, by the end of the revolution, many samurai and daimyo, and even the new government, were deeply in debt to wealthy merchants. To try to help the situation, the daimyo would be granted an income and the government would take over their debts. The Japanese world had now changed. Feudalism, which had been a big part of Japanese society, was abolished and millions of people could choose their occupations and do what they wanted. The new slogan was Fokoko Kyohei, which meant enrich the country and strengthen the military, in contrast with the old slogan, honor the emperor and expel the barbarians. In 1885, a cabinet was formed to write the national constitution. In 1889, they wrote a national constitution that was given to the people by the emperor. After the constitution was signed, Japan went to war in order to strengthen national pride.
Japan won a war against China in 1895 called the Sino-Japanese War. They also won a war against Russia, and in 1910 made Korea a colony. And in 1873 they passed a law that anyone over the age of 21 had to serve 3 years in the army and 6 years in the reserve army.
Foreign experts were hired to establish Japanese factories and educational systems. The textile industry grew quickly and remained Japan's largest industry for years to come. Students were sent to Europe and America to study modern science and technology. They built modern transportation and communication systems. By 1880, all the major cities in Japan were linked by telegraph. The first railroad in Japan was built in 1872, and in 1873 there was an agricultural tax reform that provided Japan's primary source of income. In the same year, the people of Japan were granted religious freedom. Shinto replaced Buddhism as the nation's official religion, with the emperor at the head. It was believed that the emperor was descended from the sun goddess, making him semi-divine. The Meiji Restoration caused all of these modernizations in Japan's culture, economy, and army. Just before the Restoration is said to have officially ended, it made its final mark on Japan. On February 8, 1904, Japan engaged in a war with Russia, a conflict which is famously known as the Russo-Japanese War.
Japan and Russia were fighting over territories in Korea and Manchuria. What happened next caught the whole world off guard. On August 10, 1904, Japan won Port Arthur from the Russians, which allowed them to gain the upper hand and win the Battle of Sandepu, Mukden, and Tsushima. On September 5, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed.
War was finally won, and with it, Japan had gained the respect of the world. It led to the annexation of Korea, in which Koreans signed the Yose Treaty. This treaty placed Korea under Japanese occupation and declared it a Japanese protectorate. In 1912, the Meiji period ended, and 2 years later, Japan entered World War I on the side of the British Empire. The siege of Tsingtao proved successful for Japan, and in it they ended up gaining many German landholdings. After years of aggressive expansion came World War II. World War II was the culminating efforts of Japan's imperial ambition set forth by the Meiji Restoration. Japan was already in a brutal war with China and neighboring countries when they joined Germany and Italy on the side of the Axis on September 1st, 1939. The biggest obstacle standing in their way was the United States and its relentless efforts to keep Japanese expansion under control. Japan decided to take action, and thanks to the Restoration, they had the modern army that was capable of posing a threat. So on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Air Force launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in an attempt to destroy the U.S. naval fleet. This attack ended up backfiring when the U.S. began to focus all of its war efforts on the Japanese. On September 2, 1942, Japan formally surrendered, and it was occupied by the Allied powers. However, this wasn't entirely a bad thing. Yes, the empire had fallen, but the effects of the Meiji Restoration were still a huge part of Japan, and now they had an opportunity to start again with the help of the United States.
The Meiji Restoration had already set forth an industrial revolution in Japan, and now there was an entire generation of well-educated Japanese people ready to make their impact on the rest of the world.
There was one elementary school for every 600 Japanese children. In addition, the public education system promoted industrial development. This, in turn, allowed Japan to become an industrial nation and led the way in the technological rat race. They are now the world's largest exporter of technology, such as cars, and are the third richest nation on Earth, all thanks to the Meiji Restoration.
They replaced the old feudalistic class-based society with a modern, free, and opportunistic society for the people of Japan. The new emperor, Emperor Meiji, connected Japan to the outside world and its new ideas and technology. He strengthened the army and economy of Japan.
The Restoration is a time of unequaled importance for Japan, but its effects are felt far beyond its borders. The Meiji Restoration had a lasting impression on the entire world and opened it up to a new nation with new opportunities and new markets. It gave the world revolutionary technological advances. The Meiji Restoration was probably the most influential time in all of Japan's history and greatly contributed to Japan's position in the world today.